Today I'm talking to Heather Barrett, Science Communication Director and Research Scientist at Sea Otter Savvy in California, in the US. Hi, Heather. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Hi, Robert. I'm so excited to be here today and chat with you and tell you guys more about sea otters.
Thank you. Sea otters are so little. You think of keystone species as huge creatures like wolves, lions, and elephants. Why are cute sea otters a keystone species?
First of all, sea otters are actually larger than we think they are because a lot of what we see when they're in the water is just what we see at the surface. So, actually, sea otters are more like medium sized or even up to large sized dogs. And so, in California, the southern sea otter males can weigh up to about 65 pounds. They're actually bigger than you think. But what makes a keystone species is that species, that sea otters, for example, have a really big impact on other plants and animals in their community. So just a few sea otters can impact all those other species to a really big amount. And that term keystone comes from architecture. And it's a center stone that's placed in an arch. And when you remove that stone, all of those other blocks start to fall and crumble. And what that emphasizes is that all those different connections fall and they start to change. And so with sea otters specifically, the reason they're a keystone species directly ties into their physiology. They are relatively small, right? They're a small marine mammal, which means that they live their entire life in the ocean and feed in the ocean. And they live on the Pacific side, which is really cold. So our ocean is very cold on this side, and they have to survive. And as you're a mammal, you can imagine you have to maintain your internal body temperature, right? We're not like lizards, right? We do need to make sure that our organs stay a certain temperature. And so sea otters are constantly battling the cold water to stay warm. They don't store fat like blubber like other marine mammals. They only rely on that fur. And so to do this, to help keep warm, it's not just the fur, it's how much food they can eat. So they eat a ton of food. And so when they're eating all of those different types of prey, they're putting pressure on those communities, and that starts to shape and develop their different community along our coastlines. And so that's actually why they're a keystone species. It has to do with the fact that they have to stay warm in a cold environment.
Sea otters can eat 25% of their body weight every day in sea urchins. Why are sea urchins so bad?
Sea otters do eat up to about 25% of their body weight a day. So if you think about that, let's use really easy numbers. You're 100 pounds, that's 25 pounds of food a day that you have to ingest. And so it's that amount of food that you have to eat that goes out into that community. Now, sea otters do eat a lot of urchins. Urchins are one of their prey items, but they do eat many different types of invertebrates, which are animals without backbones. So that's crabs, clams, abalone, lots of different types of things, even snails. And so urchins are one particular type of herbivore, which means that they eat sort of plant matter, and they specifically like to eat kelp. If they are not left unchecked, if they don't have a predator that's putting some pressure on their population, they can just keep breeding and they keep being more of them. And so it's not that they're inherently bad, it's the fact that if they're missing that keystone species, populations increase. They eat food, and their food is going to be kelp. So if they eat all the kelp, well, the kelp starts to disappear. And that consequently impacts all the other species that rely on the kelp as their home, as their habitat.
Seaweeds like kelp sequester nearly 200 million tons of carbon dioxide every year. That's how much the United Arab Emirates emit annually. My favorite thing I read about sea otters is they snuggle together holding hands to keep from drifting apart. Is that really true?
So you brought up something that we like to kind of myth bust, or it's fact versus fiction that we do a lot with Sea Otter Savvy. So sea otters are very charismatic. That's something that people love about them. This is a bit of a history when it comes to paw holding. So there's a bit of misinformation through social media and how that got spread. Sea otters are physically capable of holding paws, but that is not a behavior that we attribute to all sea otters. Like in a textbook, this is a behavior that you're going to see. It actually was documented in an aquarium. And so two aquarium otters, that means that they were in captivity, not in the wild, were caught on camera and holding paws, and that went viral, right? So at the beginning of social media, and everyone really fell into that. And then that idea that sea otters hold paws to not float away from each other in the wild kind of ran rampant. But to give you an idea, there was actually a poll at one of the research conferences for sea otters, and we determined that it was less than 0.0001% likely to see sea otters holding paws in the wild. So, but What is so interesting is that they do something to not float away from each other and to stay in those rafts, but it's not holding each other, right? Because if all the otters are holding their paws together and there's, let's say, 20 otters, they could still float away. They would all float together, but they might still float away. So this is where I bring kelp back in. Kelp is such an important habitat for sea otters as well, because they actually use the fronds of the kelp that is at the surface. They'll pick it up with their teeth and then they'll roll themselves up like a burrito in the kelp, including their pups too. And they are then anchored to the bottom of the ocean. So when the waves and the swell starts to move them, you'll see them bobbing, but they're not going to float away, right? Because they're anchored there with that kelp. And that's how they all stay together. So I think it's a really interesting fact, and sort of taking some misinformation and turning it back into something that they actually do, and what's really amazing in that connection with kelp forests.
That's really cool. What is the funniest thing that ever happened to you while studying sea otters?
This is one very memorable moment when I was studying sea otters. We were in the middle of collecting data, behavioral scan. That's when we go out and we're collecting information on specific otters and what they're doing in time. And I was watching a raft of resting otters in a very small kelp patch right off of Monterey, very, very close to shore. And you can even almost see the bottom of the rocky bottom. And I was about to take my scan and I started to see all these bubbles. And I saw the otters start to become alert, which is something that we like to record, is, oh, there's a potential disturbance happening. And we're really generally focused on human disturbance to sea otters, but we record all the different type of stimuli, different things that could be disturbing sea otters, including wildlife and other instances. And up from those bubbles comes a gray whale calf. And almost as if that gray whale calf was trying to play a trick on them. The otters weren't hurt at all, but he just kind of popped right up in the center. All the otters moved away, and then he just kind of went back down, and you could see him pop up along the shore in other spots. So he was probably just with his mother, who was a little bit probably further offshore, and he was just checking things out. But it was pretty amazing to see, and I think we all kind of laughed at that because the otters were all like, oh my goodness, and then they all came back and started to rest again.
With populations once estimated at close to 300,000, sea otters were hunted for their coats until there were only about 1,000 left. At the beginning of this century, they are still on the ICUN endangered red list. How many are there today?
So sea otters lived along Pacific coast. That's down in Baja, Mexico, all the way up through Alaska, Aleutian Isles, into Russia, and even into Japan. And historically, there would have been anywhere from about, they estimate 150 to 300,000 individuals along that range. But sea otters coexisted with native peoples for an extremely long time. And when that maritime fur trade came in, everyone wanted to have their fur because it's so prized, decimated the populations. And by 1911, when they finally were afforded protection, there was only about 13 remaining colonies, just small groups of sea otter populations along that range. And so now we do recognize 3 different subspecies of otters. So you have the Eurasian sea otter, and that's what's going to be up in Russia and what might be recovering back into Japan, which is very exciting. You have the northern sea otter, which is Alaska down through Canada, British Columbia, and a little bit into Washington. And then we have our California southern sea otter, and that is a very small population that survived off of an area called Big Sur. It's a very rugged coastline, so it's likely that they survived because they were not able to be found. And so all of the sea otters that you see today in California are related to those few individuals, just a dozen to maybe 20, so not very many. And so genetically, they're actually very similar, and that can be a risk for them. But right now, it is estimated for the southern sea otter, there's only about 3,000 individuals, and there's only a limited coastline where we have them in California. So you can really start to sense that even though in the northern sea otters, the population's rebounding a little bit faster, and even Eurasian otters, there's more of them as well, the California sea otter is still listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act, and they're also protected under the Marine Mammal Protection Act.
It's good that they're growing again.
Yeah, there's been recovery, right? So with the protections that we have in place and a lot of the research, and that's why research is so important, and outreach to people to educate about sea otters is so important. But it is important to note that right now they're population is still pretty small and their range is pretty small. And so there's been a lot of questions and research looking into why that is.
It's illegal to hunt them, isn't it?
Yes, it is illegal to hunt or harm or even disturb a sea otter. They are protected. And so that's why we always try to emphasize keeping people's distance and respecting the locals.
Oh, what do you wish more people knew about sea otters?
I wish that people would recognize that they're individuals, but they're also our neighbors. They're actually a species that lives very close to shore, right? They live in the nearshore community. They they eat there, they live there. And so when you happen to see them and you're in those areas, you can kind of consider them an extension of your neighborhood, right? Because they're not too far offshore. And when we think of them as being part of our community and part of our neighborhood, we end up having a little bit more respect for them as well. So I think in the area specifically here in California, we're very populated with people. We have very heavily populated coastlines, and a lot of times that overlaps in Central California with Southern Sea Otter range. And so we end up having conflicts and disturbance to the species, and that ends up being something that we work heavily on trying to avoid as it impacts them greatly. There's a cost to disturbance to sea otters, and I think that's something that we try to educate people on. And then as well as making sure that people understand the history of sea otters and sort of where their range is, and hopefully one day maybe we'll see them return into other areas where they historically should be.
Yeah, why are there still so few?
We do know that even though they've been protected, range expansion can be very, very slow. And when I mean range expansion, that means from where the population is and it slowly starts to move out along that coastline. In California, we have protections in certain different types of rugged coastline. And so some areas are maybe provide different types of prey items than others. And so there's that aspect. You also have to consider that in an area where there's maybe less population to start with fewer individuals, it takes a little bit longer versus maybe in the northern range, there would have been more individuals. So it's faster to sort of repopulate an area when you have more individuals. But in California, we have seen range expansion pretty well through the Central California range. And then in the last 20 years, we really haven't seen any more expansion. So sea otters are really sort of staying where they have been for the last 20 years. And that brings up question as to why is that? Why is the range not expanding? So why is population starting to hit kind of a carrying capacity? They're not seeming to go up much more. They're sort of just wiggling along this 3,000 number, right? Well, both at the north and south end of the range, where they end up ending, the northern end of the range is near Año Nuevo State Park. That's an elephant seal rookery, and that attracts a lot of great white sharks. So great white sharks, when they're young, eat fish, and when they start to transition in their juvenile teen years, they start to eat marine mammals. And so they like to eat elephant seals because they're full of blubber. There's lots of nutrition in that. But in learning how to eat those animals, they also will take exploratory bites of sea otters, and sea otters don't have blubber. So they're all fur and bones. So they usually get spit out, but a bite from a great white shark is usually lethal. And so what ends up happening is we are able to recover a lot of those individuals that die or strand on shore, and that gets sort of recorded, and we start to get a better idea of, well, how are sea otters dying? And so mortality for sea otters, the highest mortality is related to great white shark bites. So that's one thing that's happening at the northern end of the range, which is so interesting. The second is that there is not a whole lot of kelp available for them up in that particular region. Right at the end, it becomes sandy bottom. Kelp requires rocky bottom to be able to grow. So there's sort of this really long expanse before sea otters could have protection or sort of refuge and a safe place to be. And then the third thing that we have to consider, and these might be sort of all different things that might be happening combined, is that female sea otters don't like to leave home. They really like to be site specific. They live in one area. They don't go very far. And so if they are born and then they live probably near to where mom is too, so just they inch very slowly northwards or southwards, right? Versus if you're hit with something like this, like a gauntlet, it's not likely that females are going to want to make that gauntlet. So those are some of the ideas and hypotheses that researchers are thinking about when why is it that we aren't seeing better range expansion? Because with range expansion means more population increase, right? Because if there's already too many otters in one spot, they're all fighting for the same prey, they're going to be limited. So this is sort of questions, and this brought up lots of discussion around potential reintroduction into Northern California and Oregon, into this area where historically sea otters would have been, but we have been missing them for a long time.
What can kids do to help sea otters recover?
There's a lot of things that we all can do to help sea otters recover. The first is doing stuff like this, learning about sea otters, becoming aware of sea otters, how they impact you. There are some local things that sea otters do, right, in the local communities. But even though you are across the country, when it comes to climate change resiliency and the fact that you had mentioned kelp and carbon sequestration, and sea otters also help with storm management. So as you have more kelp and more eelgrass beds and estuaries, flooding sort of is dampened. So there's a lot of different things that sea otters can do to help us, even though we aren't necessarily right there on the coastline. So things that we recommend that people can do is, one, become aware. You can follow us with Sea Otter Savvy. We always like to educate people about what's going on with sea otters. We also do Sea Otter Awareness Week, which is September 24th through 30th this year. We're going to have a series of different events. You can learn and participate in those events as well. Things that you can just do generally to help the ocean is reduce your plastic use, reduce your carbon use. And if you really are interested in the conversation around potential reintroduction, I recommend and urge you guys to check out the We Were Here Sea Otter program page, which is through our website, seattersavvy.org under Get Involved. And there is information there as well as a survey. So you can share your voice. So doesn't matter what age you are all stakeholders, you're all involved in this conversation around potential reintroduction. And we would love to hear from you. So you can take that survey and you can share it with others. And if kids have teachers that they would like to learn more about, they can share that with them and we can teach classes as well.
This has been a really great talk. Thanks so much for taking the time to chat with me today. Click the link below to donate to Sea Otter Savvy. And remember, together kids can save the world. Please like and subscribe. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.